Welcome back to the final micro lecture of the module. During our time together today, we are going to expand the government regulation conversation and begin discussing what happens to substances that are deemed highly addictive. We will work our way through the programs that have helped to combat addiction through the lens of government regulation. Let's get started. Taking a step back to the origins of drug prohibition and control, we have to discuss the first legitimate effort by the federal government to regulate and control the production and importation of addicting substances. The Harrison Act of 1914 attempted to regulate and tax the production, importation, and distribution of opiate and coca products. Post-Civil War, there were so many people using opiate products, largely as a result of war injuries. We peaked in terms of opiate use in 1896, using 500,000 pounds of opium per year. Roughly 2/3 to 3/4 of opium addicts were actually women, and they were given opium products for their female problems. Then manufacturers realized that opiates could be used for other things, like the patent medicines that we discussed earlier in the module. But this act was not in relation to the patent medicines we discussed before. We had different laws to address the manufacture of those products. This new law was put in place in response to two things. First, at the time, there was a significant increase in the use of cocaine in the South by newly freed persons. This was a huge concern for white citizens in the South because there was an erroneous but very pervasive belief that these newly freed black men would go around and rape white women, and with that stimulant going through them. According to historians, Southerners also believed that the newly freed men would use the cocaine as a mechanism to learn to shoot firearms better, which was also considered a threat against the Southern way of life. The second great concern rested with the increased use of opiate products, specifically nearly pure opium that was being smoked on the West Coast. Opium dens were brought over to the United States by Chinese immigrants who came over to help build the railroads. They were perceived to be a huge threat, and there were many stories like this one in the picture, where a white detective would bust open the opium dens that were infiltrating the communities. There are also many reports out there that discuss the racial implications of these efforts, specifically as they pertain to Chinese immigrants. So, as you can see from these perceived threats, that it wasn't so much about the drugs, but about the individuals who were using these drugs. We don't have a problem with recovering soldiers or their wives using opium, but we have a huge problem when it comes to the drug of choice for certain ethnic minorities. We'll see this racial threat pop up again and again as we discuss drug laws in this country. It'll be a prevalent theme this semester, even into the drug law overhauls that were enacted into the 1980s. By 1914, 46 states had regulations on cocaine, and 29 had laws against opium-based products. But that's at the state level. So then the feds came in and they decided that they were going to get involved in it as well. Even though the government was correct in trying to limit the availability of things like cocaine and opioids, were they correct in their reasoning? A large amount of their argument was regarding the regulating of commerce. But this is the first government law that is going to work to restrict and outlaw recreational use of certain narcotics. But even still, it's not difficult to get at all, and not all drugs are being restricted in the way that they will be later. This is a picture of the Sears and Roebuck catalog. You can see here that there's cocaine available and also opium. Opium gum comes from the cracking open of a poppy seed pod. You will get a milky fluid that then comes out, and that's opium in its purest form. As the fluid is exposed to air, it gets thicker and turns into a black gum-like substance. The gum is then scraped out of the seed pod completely, and it stacks it, and you can make bricks or cakes or small bundles to sell. We'll talk about this more later this semester when we get into opioids. But this catalog page suggests that it is not difficult at all to get really hard narcotics. You can order them through the mail of all things. So the prior arguments about the opium dens are somewhat muted when you can order both cocaine and pure opium right from Sears. So you have a country full of people who are using patent medicines, smoking opium, drinking Coca-Cola, and a variety of other things. Now the government wants to step in and they want to regulate things. How are they going to do that? They're going to tax it, like they do everything else. This is a huge argument in favor of more recent marijuana legalization efforts, where large-scale tax revenues could be generated through the sale of legalized pot. The biggest piece of legislation regarding drug regulation comes in 1970, in which drugs are divided into different categories based on their potential for abuse and their medical purposes. The Controlled Substances Act is actually the one that creates the drug schedules. The Nixon administration put this piece of legislation together, that requires the FDA and the DEA to put drugs into different schedules. It allows them to move things around and allows for restructuring as need be. This was put into effect after years of studying the rate of drug use. We're still involved in a large-scale counterculture climate. People are smoking and using everything everywhere and are receiving very little penalties for use at this point. Marijuana is the big drug that they study. Nixon appoints this commission who comes back and says that the penalties, quote, "The criminal law is too harsh a tool to apply to personal possession, even in the effort to discourage use. It implies an overwhelming indictment of the behavior which we believe is not appropriate. The actual and potential harm of use of the drug is not great enough to justify intrusion by criminal law into private behavior, a step which our society takes only with the greatest reluctance," end quote. They advocate for decriminalization of marijuana. The findings of the study are ignored and scheduling continues on. The federal government does not implement decriminalization, but 11 states do implement it. But in terms of punishment, they advocated first for treatment and punishment later for possession offenses. But this marks the beginning of the war on drugs, but the term is not used by Nixon until the next year. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 created 5 drug schedules that classified substances based on their risk of addiction and their perceived medicinal value. Schedule 1 drugs are the most risky substances and have no perceived medicinal value. Schedule 5 drugs are the least risky and the least regulated in terms of purchase. Schedule 1 is the most restrictive. There is no medically accepted use in the U.S. This is part of what the whole medical marijuana debate is over. Does it actually have a medicinal use? Other drugs in Schedule 1 include heroin, which is an opium derivative, LSD, which is a hallucinogen, ecstasy, also known as MDA or Molly, it's an upper, peyote, a hallucinogen used for Native American ceremonies, marijuana, from the cannabis plant, obviously, and different plants are better for different things. Hashish or hash, it's a cannabis product of compressed or purified preparations of stalked resin. It contains THC, but is more highly concentrated than the buds or the leaves. In Schedule 2, there is a medicinally accepted use in the U.S., but because these things are so addictive, they have to be regulated by a doctor in a controlled environment. Morphine and opium are painkillers. Morphine, heroin, and codeine are all derivatives of opium. Cocaine is used as a numbing agent and will numb the lining of your nose or gums, mouth, or throat. It also helps to decrease swelling because cocaine restricts your blood vessels. Meth, we know, is a stimulant drug and can be used to treat deficit hyperactivity disorder, but it is rarely prescribed for such. Hitler was prescribed meth towards the end of the war because his energy kept dragging. PCP was originally created as an anesthetic drug, more commonly known as angel dust, and it is a hallucinogen. Barbiturates are depressants which can also be used as anesthetics and can also be used to treat cluster headaches. Recreationally, it just makes you tired and sluggish. In Schedule 3, things like Tylenol with codeine or hydrocodone, normally things that are cut with other medications. However, all hydrocodone products were moved to Schedule 2 as of 2018. In Schedule 4, you still need a prescription, but they are not considered over-the-counter drugs. Schedule 5, you don't need a prescription at all, but they are checking to see if you aren't building a meth lab in your house because you're buying cases of Sudafed D at the drugstore. The actual or relative potential for abuse of the drug is important here. If it has more potential for abuse, then it will move up in the scheduling. Scientific evidence of the pharmacological effects of the drug is also important. The state of current scientific knowledge regarding this substance helps with the scheduling. This is a big issue for marijuana as it is currently a Schedule 1 drug, and those drugs receive very little scientific support for study. If you are a researcher trying to determine the effects of the drug, you need government approval to study it, or you're breaking the law by finding some to study. So there are actual pot farms that the government uses for studies, but there aren't too many out there. It's the history and the current pattern of abuse we need to consider. Has it been a threat before? Have there been issues with people using the substance abusively over the years? What, if any, risk is there to the public health? We see this one come into play with opiate prescriptions that have recently moved from Schedule 3 to Schedule 2 classifications. What about the psychological or physiological dependence liability of the drug? What are the withdrawals like? Can you die from it? Whether the substance is an immediate precursor of a substance already that is being controlled. All of the opioid prescription drugs out there are an excellent example here. They are derivatives of opium as the parent drug. So there is medicinal value, but there is also a high risk. So where do you classify these knowing that there's a history here? This chart shows the dangerousness of the drug in terms of toxicity. For those ratios, you see the effective dose to the lethal dose. So I feel the effect and then how many doses it would take to kill you. Let's look at what's right at the top of the list. The least toxic drug possible, cannabis, followed by psilocybin or mushrooms, psychedelic compounds that cause hallucinogens. Then LSD, aspirin, nitrous oxide, which is laughing gas. It makes you super happy and can be used as a sedative at the dentist. More commonly, it's derived from whippets, meaning whipped cream cans, and then you can fill a balloon and breathe in the nitrous from that balloon. Think of the tank of nitrous at the doctor's office. We have Prozac, which is an SSRI antidepressant, phenobarbital. This can be used to treat seizures that come from withdrawal from benzodiazepines. It's also a central nervous system depressant. DMT, it's a psychedelic similar to psilocybin. Then caffeine, ketamine, which can be used as a painkiller. It's a depressant as well. Rohypnol, which is a date rape drug and a depressant. Mescaline, this is a psychedelic like LSD. Then tobacco and methadone. Methadone is an opioid that helps to combat heroin dependence. Codeine, which is an opium derivative. MDMA, meaning ecstasy or Molly, that's an upper. Then we have cocaine, methamphetamine, dextromorphin, which is a cough suppressant that is derived from the opium family. This is an active ingredient in a lot of over-the-counter drugs. Think of Mucinex DM, Vicks, NyQuil, and Coricidin. Then we have alcohol and isobutyl nitrate. Isobutyl nitrate is an inhalant type of recreational drug many people know as poppers. This was really famous in the disco scene and then again in the rave scene. Many people take them right before they're going to have sex because it creates a euphoric feeling. GHB comes next. That treats narcolepsy, meaning insomnia or depression, and alcoholism. This is a club drug that can come in a powder form and is often used with alcohol. When you mix these drugs, that's normally when the overdose kicks in. You can dissolve the powder in water and it almost tastes like salt water, but a little bit off. And finally, we have heroin. This is the one that has the smallest window to get right. Many people who overdose on heroin actually die because they get air caught in their veins from not shooting up correctly. For the last few minutes of lecture, I want to talk about dependency issues and what solutions are available to help with these issues. So, if we're talking about dependence or addiction, that's something that is recognized as an illness. Narcotics addiction and alcoholism are both recognized by the American Medical Association as an illness. And even the United States Supreme Court states that there are statuses that cannot be prosecuted for simply being an addict. And if someone is really addicted, then we raise the question as to whether or not incarceration and criminal punishment is the way to go. Do we throw you in prison for the rest of your life, or do we get you help? Arguably, a user is very different from a dealer. The dealer might also use, but if they are helping to facilitate others' use, that's a different story. So that person should go to prison for a longer period of time. But we're also seeing the low-level users going to prison for a good chunk of time as well, due to the language written in the 1980s legislation coming out of the Reagan administration. Does effectiveness mean putting people in prison, or does it mean stopping the drug problem? Are we being effective either way? Drug courts were one of the first specialty courts to really focus on one of the main problems that a lot of offenders face: substance abuse. Drug courts started in Miami in the late 1980s in order to curtail some of the high numbers of drug offenders that were coming out of the area then. If you know anything about Miami in the 1980s, what you saw were a lot of drug runners who were bringing in high-quality coke to the place. It is a party town with a lot of money, and people were enjoying that scene. The problem was that the coke in the 1970s and 80s was no longer a rich person drug. If you cut the powder cocaine with baking powder, and whatever else you want to lace it with, you will end up with crack, which is cheaper, and some people claim it to be more addictive because you have to smoke it rather than snort it. But pharmacologically, it's basically the same drug. So while the powder was a problem, the crack was becoming a much bigger problem in the city. Because of the growing number of drug defendants being seen in court, the city got together with the state, including the state attorney, Janet Reno, and the public defender, Bennett Brummer, and put together this system that allowed drug offenders to receive treatment rather than just be locked up in hopes that they would dry out. They were also really tired of seeing the same faces in court all the time for the same problems. Each state is going to run their courts a little bit differently, but for the most part, they're run off of the Miami model. It is going to include all of these items. The map shows that of all the drug courts and their concentrations based on county locations as of 2023. As you can see, there are a higher concentration of drug courts around more metropolitan areas where there are higher concentrations of drug use. When you get to more rural areas, they start to thin out a little bit. Larger populations equal a greater need for these resources. As of 2023, there were a little over 4,000 adult drug courts across the U.S. with an annual budget of more than $61 billion to regulate these specialized court systems. Drug courts are really only for a specialized type of offender in order to stop the addiction rather than punish the addiction. You aren't going to see the drug traffickers or large-scale dealers going to these drug courts. These are used for the low-level offender who really might only have a small personal use amount on his person, or is going to be arrested for a non-violent offense that was committed to aid the addiction. But at the end of the day, these individuals still committed a crime. So how does that balance out? Really, what these specialized courts say to the offender is that either you comply and go to treatment and get sober, or you will go to jail and/or prison. It is basically a suspended sentence. You won't go to prison unless you violate the terms of your drug court conditions. Then you'll go. Then the question becomes, does it actually work? And the answer to this is yes. This infographic shows that there was roughly a 32% difference in recidivism rates for those individuals who went through a drug court program versus those who did not. And if you can get the drug users to stop using, not only are they healthier, but they also are not going back to jail. And that saves us roughly $7 to $9 million per drug court annually. That's a lot of money that shows that they're worth continuing for sure. We will discuss drug courts in more detail later this semester, but they are a great representation and acknowledgement that there is a drug problem throughout the U.S., and it was exacerbated in part by some of the laws and sentencing structures that were not meant to curtail some of the use. In the next module, we're going to turn our attention to tobacco and talk about what happens when regulation allows for substances to continue to kill us even when we know there are issues. I'll see you then.